The Evil Within 2 is a better game than its predecessor, however it's also a less interesting one. That probably means this video is less interesting than the one I made on the first game, but keep watching anyway, please. Many of my criticisms of the original have either been fixed or at least improved upon to the extent they no longer detract from my enjoyment. The stealth is now an integral part of the entire game instead of being introduced at the beginning and then unceremoniously dumped after the first 2 hours. The combat is smoother for the most part with more weapon choice and a melee attack that occasionally actually does damage to enemies. You even use your knife instead of swinging hopelessly with your fists. The story largely makes sense, and while the pacing is far from perfect, it's a lot smoother than the original's jarring shifts in both tone and setting. The Evil Within 2 is a better experience than the first game, and it's one I can confidently recommend to most gamers. And yet, the magic of the original is missing. I gave the first Evil Within 3 stars out of 5, but it wasn't boring in its mediocrity. I described it as a game of highs and lows that settled at mediocrity. The sequel opts to play it safe. The story is far easier to follow, but it's treading familiar waters, an accusation you certainly couldn't throw at its predecessor. There are no bad levels in the sequel, but there aren't many that will stick long in the memory either. Tango Gameworks appears to have taken the criticism to heart, and it might have overcorrected a touch too much. Still, I had a great time with The Evil Within 2, and I'm giving it a 4 out of 5. I enjoyed multiple playthroughs and highly recommend it, despite some annoyances. It's worth noting that I'm playing on PS4, which means I'm using a controller. That's pretty important for reasons we'll see later. This video will contain full spoilers for the entire game. If you'd like my spoiler-free opinion, then check out the written review on my website. It's linked to in the description. I'm going to give another spoiler warning when I'm about a third of the way through the story, so if you're on the fence, then perhaps watch the video up until that point. As I write this script, the single-player Star Wars game being developed by Visceral has just been cancelled, and while I'm not convinced that single-player games are dead, it's important to support the ones we like. The Evil Within 2 has no microtransactions and no DLC has been announced so far. It's a relatively complete experience. If you're at all interested, I recommend you give it a shot. As always, this video is a mixture of commentary and critique. I'll go through the major story beats and we'll stop to do gameplay analysis at random intervals. I'll lean more heavily on commentary at the beginning because the game takes a while to introduce all of its gameplay mechanics. The video is quite long, so there will be timestamps in the description if you want to watch in stages. The story discussion in this video will make more sense if you're familiar with the story in the original game. It should still be possible to follow along without that knowledge though, and I'll do my best to frame the discussion in a way that will make sense to everyone. If you need a recap on the first game, then there should be a link to my video on that appearing on the screen right about now. One final point to note. Some of the early gameplay footage I use here is from my New Game Plus run. I prefer to use New Game footage for these videos, but due to corrupted footage from my Survival and Nightmare runs, the only video I had left of the early game was New Game Plus. If you see Sebastian with a lot of weapons, health and stamina early on, then that's why. And with that out of the way, let's get stuck into the story. Our protagonist, Sebastian, starts off outside a burning house. If you paid attention to the journal entries in the first game or played the DLC, then you'll realise this is a vision of the fire that killed Sebastian's daughter Lily 2 years before the start of the first game. As I discussed in my first video, the story surrounding Lily was clearly added late in development specifically for this sequel. Sebastian bursts into the house and makes it to Lily's bedroom, where he's confronted by an image of his daughter burning to death as she taunts him for failing to save her life. This is the not so subtle theme of the game, Sebastian trying to get over his guilt surrounding his daughter's death. The guilt was never so much as touched on in the first game due to it being a late story addition, but I'll stop going on about that. Sebastian wakes up in a dark bar with 2 men in dark suits and sunglasses just chilling at the bar after a hard day of work and totally not working for an evil organisation that wants to take over the world. Kidman quickly shows up and sits down opposite him. It's been 3 years since the events at Beacon Mental Hospital in the first game, and Sebastian hasn't seen Kidman since. From the DLC we learned that Kidman was a mole working for a sinister organisation known as Mobius. Sebastian knows that Mobius exists, but hasn't found out anything about them. For now, it's worth noting that Sebastian has a bandage on one hand and Kidman is wearing a glove on one hand. There's a reason for that. There's a quick exposition dump where we find out that Kidman continued working for Mobius after the events of the first game, even though she found out they were evil. She informs Sebastian that his daughter Lily isn't really dead. Mobius started the fire, faked Lily's death, and kidnapped her for use in its experiments. Lily's being used as the core for a new stem, and Mobius needs Sebastian's help to get her back. STEM is an imaginary world of sorts which is powered by the mind of one individual who is known as the core. Both games take place nearly entirely inside STEM. If you die in STEM, you die in real life. The easiest comparison is just to think of STEM as being like the Matrix. Sebastian doesn't believe Kidman, but with the help of the 2 guys at the bar, Kidman is able to drug Sebastian until he collapses unconscious. He wakes up in a wheelchair inside a Mobius building. Mobius built a new STEM system after the events at Beacon and still has ambitions of using STEM to connect every human mind together in the name of world domination. There's some talk of creating a world of peace without war, but it's not entirely convincing coming from a group of guys in suits who kidnap young girls for experiments. Mobius kidnapped Lily to use her as the core of STEM because she had a pure and innocent mind. The best people to use for cores are those with pure minds or psychopaths. Mobius tried using psychopaths and it didn't work out so well. Lily's been the most stable core Mobius has ever tested, until now. Mobius lost trace of Lily in the STEM system a week ago, and now this version of STEM is collapsing. The head of Mobius, a man known as the Administrator, tells Sebastian that this is his chance to save Lily after his failure to do so last time. This is the recurring theme of piling the guilt onto Sebastian, so you'll see a lot of it. Before going into STEM, Kidman whispers to Sebastian that there will be someone in there waiting for him. We then see a few flashbacks of Sebastian arguing with his wife Myra. This is from after the fire but before Myra went missing. Myra's convinced that Lily is still alive, but Sebastian puts it down to her not dealing with the grief. Again, it's all about piling the guilt onto Sebastian. In case you didn't play the DLC, Myra went missing shortly after their daughter's supposed death. She left a note to say that she'd been investigating a bigger conspiracy. At the end of the DLC, we found out she's been working for Mobius, but Sebastian doesn't know any of that yet. Sebastian arrives in STEM via a representation of his office. This place functions as his safe room in the same way the hospital did in the first game. Whereas the hospital was created by Leslie's memories, this room is created by Sebastian's. That could have a deeper meaning, such as Sebastian now being able to exert a degree of control over STEM, but I suspect it's just a convenient location. 5 important Mobius employees, mainly engineers, were sent into STEM to try and find Lily, but they've all gone missing. A few combatants were also sent in, but no one seems to care too much about them. Kidman talks to Sebastian over a radio and tells him to keep an eye out for the Mobius team. They can't be extracted because STEM doesn't have a core while Lily is missing. Once again, Sebastian moves to and from his safe room via mirrors.
Why couldn't my memory just make regular doors?
There's a brief flashback to a scene with Myra and Lily, which even for those of us who played the first game is still the first time we've seen them all together. Sebastian wanders around an old building complete with art exhibitions and a photographer's darkroom. Sebastian stumbles across William Baker's room. Baker was the lead of the 5 Mobius employees sent into STEM. Sebastian walks inside and sees Baker's body hanging in the air, constantly reliving the moment of his death. I saw this in one of the trailers, but it's still visually impressive when you first see it, which is good because in terms of gameplay we aren't doing a lot yet. At this stage of the first game we were already trying to sneak our way through a small village infested with Haunted and fighting against underdeveloped stealth mechanics. I'm sure this introduction is too slow for some, but it does a great job building the tension first time through. On subsequent playthroughs it's something you'll want to skip. You then find a letter inviting someone to partake in one of the Mu Center's spiritual acuity tests. As the letter makes clear, this group is a quasi-religion, along the lines of Scientology, I guess. I probably shouldn't have mentioned them, should I? Are they going to come for me now? If you don't hear from me, then I'm probably locked up in Tom Cruise's basement. You watch a man called Stefano kill someone and capture their death in suspended animation, as with Baker. There's another cool scene as a creature known as a Guardian bursts through the mirror and gives chase. The Guardian is made up of numerous other bodies suspended on one large spine. You can't kill the Guardian at this point, but don't worry, you'll get plenty more chances. For now, you just need to run from it and climb up into a vent. You aren't safe for long. Stefano shows up and throws a knife into your chest. You use the knife to fight off the Guardian and escape. The first game started with a similar chase scene against an enemy wielding a chainsaw. I'm not sure if the similarity is supposed to be a deliberate parallel or if it's just laziness. There's an abrupt shift in setting as Sebastian is walked to a bedroom. Sebastian runs outside and sees a woman head into a house. He follows her inside and witnesses a disturbing scene where she force feeds a boy with British Airways' finest chicken tikka masala. This scene doesn't serve much purpose other than to act as a quick tutorial for shooting. We then see a Mobius employee run into a building as another is killed by a mob of the zombie-esque creatures that this time around are known as Lost instead of Haunted. After sneaking your way past some Lost, you meet O'Neill, who has holed himself up in a safe house. He's a bit of an arsehole. He's a technician, not a soldier, and he doesn't feel at all guilty about the Mobius employee who just died trying to save him. He refuses to leave the safe house, but does offer to help Sebastian remotely. He gives Sebastian a communicator which is picking up the sound of a girl's voice, which presumably belongs to Lily. O'Neill explains that the problems in Union are due to much more than a missing core. The stable field emitter isn't working properly, but he doesn't tell us what that actually is yet. We see a ghostly image of a nurse that will be familiar to players of the first game. We're out in the open world now because, yes, all games need to have open worlds these days. Coming into the game I expected the open world levels to feel tacked on and out of place, but ended up thoroughly enjoying them. You can rush through this level if you like by just chasing down the waypoints, however you're well rewarded for exploration with more resources, background information about the world, and even weapons that you might not find otherwise. The first thing to note is that the open world levels such as this one aren't particularly large or particularly open. The open world sections all take place in sectioned off parts of a quaint traditional American town called Union. Mobius crafted a peaceful town because it felt that this would be easiest for people in STEM to adapt to. With the core missing, Union is breaking apart, which gives a convenient plot reason for the separate sections to be literally that, separate. Sebastian's communicator pinpoints the location of the signal, and if you want you can head straight there. However, you can't move far before picking up a load more signals which place new waypoints on the map. Fortunately, the map never becomes cluttered in that classic Ubisoft manner, and these waypoints never feel like a pointless distraction. Most of the waypoints are the locations of fallen Mobius soldiers, who usually have additional ammo on them or occasionally pouches which increase the amount of ammo you can carry for your weapons. Since ammo is scarce, collecting these extra supplies is nearly always worth the hassle it requires to get them. On the harder difficulties it's pretty much essential. Sebastian desperately wants to rescue his daughter, but given the challenge and survival nature of the game, I'm more than happy to accept this type of wandering around as preparing for the journey ahead. Personally, I see a big difference between collecting much needed ammo and weapons and saving random settlements for no good reason a la Fallout 4. If you don't explore, you'll miss out on important resources and weapons like the sniper rifle. You can find a sniper rifle early on, however before you can use it you need to find spare parts and repair it on your workbench. There's also a side quest of sorts in this level. You don't do a lot, nor does it really have any story impact. You move from location to location, tuning into memories of two Mobius employees who go rogue and abandon the technicians they're supposed to be protecting. One of them dies and the other is executed by Stefano. There's another side quest later that's much more interesting and I'm going to talk about it in more detail. Don't let this style quest put you off the next one. The story tries to make us care about insignificant characters that we'll never meet. It reminds me of some of the side quests in Prey where you're encouraged to care about people on the ship but only ever see a couple of emails or audio logs from them. I much prefer it when side content provides me with new information that fleshes out the world. For example, this could have been used to tell us something we don't already know about Mobius or Stefano. Instead it's just two random guys leading us to weapon stashes. I want to make a slightly cliche comparison I've seen thrown around quite a lot but also seen it dismissed just as often. While carefully exploring this environment, sneaking around enemies and collecting crafting supplies, I definitely got some Last of Us vibes. To be clear, The Evil Within 2 is not like The Last of Us as a whole. However, this chapter, and a few others, did remind me of that experience much more so than games like, say, Rise of the Tomb Raider did with their small open world areas. On my first playthrough I spent at least 5 hours on Chapter 3 when I could have easily powered through it in an hour. It's fair to say I enjoyed it, however the environment is definitely a touch bland. I'll remember this area for the sheer amount of time I spent here, but I wouldn't describe it as memorable, especially when compared to the other levels in both this game and its predecessor. Each level in The Evil Within felt carefully crafted. They were linear and narrow, but you could imagine Shinji Mikami standing over the artists approving of every pixel. The open world sections in the sequel feel like they've been slapped together in a hurry. According to Kiyata Sakai, concept art started in June 2015, so we're talking just over 2 years of production time. Mikami moved over to a producer role with John Johannes taking over directorial duties. 2 years is not a huge amount of time for a relatively new studio to make a game, and you can feel the rush in areas like this one. Instead of Shinji Mikami approving of every pixel, I can imagine a meeting where someone suggests that the game take place mainly in a quaint American town, and Mikami goes yeah, whatever, and signs off on a load of concept art knocked up by interns without giving it a second thought. To be fair, the first game took place in a mental hospital, so it was hardly all that original, but it felt like far more detail went into the art direction for each section. The Evil Within 2 uses a new engine known as the STEM engine, which I believe is a slightly altered version of InTech 5. The overall quality of the models and textures is a step up from the last game, but the engine struggles with the open world. I didn't get too many frame drops from the fixed 30 FPS on my regular PS4, but when I did they were in these open world levels. The game needs a few seconds after loading to catch up, and once or twice I had frames drop in buildings, but it wasn't a huge problem. On the other hand, the constant texture pop-in was an issue. The town is dark and yet I found it impossible not to be distracted by bushes and rocks popping in as I approached. There were also more bugs on this level than any other. Enemies would occasionally bug out. I saw them get stuck in trees, glitch through fences, and stand on the spot walking into a fence. I also stumbled upon an annoying questing bug. Maybe bug isn't quite the right word. Annoyance, I guess. There's a locked garage you can open, but once inside you can't get through a locked door. A dead body on the floor is shining a torch on a piece of wood, and I'd have bet my entire supply of shotgun shells that Sebastian could destroy the wood and crouch under the gap. Except he can't. No prompt appears on the screen. The melee attack doesn't do anything, and neither does your shotgun or pistol. It won't move. Clearly you're supposed to get into this building because there's plenty of loot on the other side and a couple of staircases on the outside of the building. I circled the entire place looking for a way in, but no luck. Eventually I gave up and continued on with the main quest. Speaking of which, Sebastian finds the signal and watches a ghostly image of Lily as she hides from someone who is chasing her. Another signal appears, and this time we watch Lily crawl through that damn gap that I was trying to get through for 20 minutes. Now you can remove the wood. Seriously, I hate this. It's incredibly sloppy. At the very least, there shouldn't have been a damn torch shining a light on the wood, making it look like you can go through there when you can't. A lot of weird shit happens in STEM. It seems silly that the developers couldn't think of a better way to disguise this route if they didn't want players to find it just yet. Or just let players through and lock the damn office door that you don't want them to go in until the right moment. Then it can unlock after Sebastian sees the vision. It's hardly that far-fetched given what else happens in STEM. A few more images of Lily show her hiding from Stefano before finally being captured. Sebastian sees Stefano summon a huge camera lens before disappearing and leaving behind a bunch of rabid creatures that look more like dogs than humans. Sebastian doesn't know where to go next, but O'Neill has found a weird signal coming from City Hall. City Hall just so happens to be floating in the sky above and is the location of one of the stable field emitters that O'Neill mentioned earlier. Presumably this stable field emitter isn't working right now, and less stable in this instance includes floating in the sky. O'Neill explains that you can reach City Hall by travelling through the Marrow. O'Neill describes these as backstage passages that are used to monitor the residents. I guess they're like the underground area at Disney World except with phase shifting. After this conversation you enter the Marrow by travelling through a computer to a dingy set of corridors. If any chapter stands out as being completely missable, it's chapter 4 where you venture into the Marrow and make it to City Hall. The Marrow itself is pretty dull. It's a maze of bland corridors that resemble the basement of a long since abandoned office building. There's a short section where you need to put on a gas mask, which for some reason requires you to go into first person mode, except for when you do stealth attacks when you're snapped back out of it again. You can't shoot for fear of igniting the gas, so you have to sneak your way through a few enemies and stealth attack an enemy known as a lament. These take 2 stealth attacks to kill, but you can easily run and hide after the first one. Out in the open world, these enemies can be tough. If they spot you, they let out a scream that drains your stamina, making it tough to run away. They have a ranged acid spit attack and a melee attack that acts as a one-hit kill. The reduced stamina attack can be a particular pain because they are often located around lots of other lost, so you can quickly get swarmed. This one is by itself and not much of a problem. Fortunately, this section is the only one in the game where you need to go into first person mode, and it's over soon enough. I will admit that this was one of the more tense parts of the entire game, however it's tense because you don't feel properly in control of what's going on. It's like the sort of tension you would get from input lag or a bad frame rate. Things might go wrong and the game becomes harder, but I wouldn't describe it as fun. When you leave the Marrow, you're in front of City Hall and almost immediately thrown into the game's first major boss fight. There are plenty of explosive barrels and oil traps on the floor, so you can kite the Guardian around until it's next to something deadly. I'm not trying to be too critical of this fight because it is the first boss, but if you played the previous game you're bound to be disappointed. There's simply nothing to the fight. The only point of interest is avoiding the battle altogether, which does at least take some degree of skill and observation. If you run around the corner you'll find a car blocking your path conveniently next to an explosive barrel. I must admit I initially assumed the barrel was just here to deal damage to the Guardian, but if you blow it up then you'll destroy the car and clear a path. There are then a few traps to avoid, and finally you make it to a door which you need to hammer on a few times to open. I tried this escape a couple of times but always had the same problem. Even if you sneak away from the Guardian, the exploding car draws its attention, as you'd expect, and therefore you have to rush through the traps and make it to the door while taking damage. As you can see, this ends up looking really silly and the Guardian just sort of disappears as you close the door behind you. I'm sure there's a way to do this without having the Guardian hitting you as you try to open the door, but I couldn't get it to work. I tried shocking the Guardian at the far end of the arena and then running, but it still quickly caught up with me. This scene would have looked a lot more impressive if Sebastian had simply kicked the door open as he approached, but I accept that I'm almost certainly missing something here. There has to be a smoother way to do this. You then meet up with another one of the 5 Mobius agents sent into STEM. Harrison gives a deathbed speech and insists that Sebastian activate the stable field emitter or Union will collapse before he can find the core. This conversation happens outside the City Hall building if you defeated the Guardian instead of running from it, which I thought was a nice touch. City Hall's level design is much more akin to that of the first game, with meticulously designed levels that you truly feel the work of a deranged artist. I'm talking about Stefano here, not the Tango Gameworks team. This is where I feel the impact of the new and improved engine, because I'm fairly certain that lighting effects like these are far beyond what we saw in the last game. There's a cool puzzle where you need to recreate a picture on the wall while dressing up a mannequin and capturing an identical image to open up a corridor. It's probably a bit generous to call it a puzzle, but it is visually impressive as the background disappears and becomes an empty space. I would have liked a few more sections like this. There are cameras all over the place in these levels, so it feels like a missed opportunity for cool optional content that rewards patient players with additional supplies. You move through narrow corridors and Stefano insists that you appreciate the art before being allowed to continue. Once you've examined his art, a door appears and you move through to a room with a giant exhibition of dead bodies that Stefano brought in from outside because they were too beautiful to be left unappreciated. I don't understand modern art, but I'm sure some pretentious rich people would happily pay money to stare at this crap and pretend they understand what it means. Sebastian turns on the stable field emitter, but it's going to take 90 seconds to power on. Stefano pops up and pauses time to taunt Sebastian in a scene that seems designed to look good in trailers more than to serve any real purpose. He disappears and leaves Obscura behind to finish off his dirty work. Obscura is a twisted version of a camera on a tripod and can freeze time with its flash. Freezing time also pauses the 90-second countdown on the stable field emitter, which can only be restarted by shooting Obscura's camera lens. This process repeats a few times until the countdown reaches 0. Obscura is deadly if you get close, but it's easy to stay out of sight. Half the time it doesn't even seem to be looking for you. Stefano doesn't bother hiding anymore. The huge camera lens aperture clearly marks the spot of a movie theatre where he's holed up. The stable field emitter has opened up new parts of the marrow, so Sebastian dives back in to access the theatre. Sebastian stumbles upon a memory with his wife, once again piling on the guilt for not trusting Myra in the first place. The world is covered in white goo, which is a recurring theme for much of the game. I believe the goo is the same substance people are bathed in when they enter STEM, but there doesn't appear to be any real explanation for it. The next boss is the first of 3 that consist nearly entirely of this weird substance. I love the aesthetic of the Watcher, from the way it menacingly looms over you at the start of the fight to the way the goo drips off it into a puddle on the floor. Unfortunately, it's a terrible fight. Right at the start you're told that you can sneak past it, and it's painfully easy to do so.
Good God, look at the size of that thing. Maybe I can sneak past it.
There was already a fairly obvious open door at the back of the room, so this hint seemed unnecessary. I like avoiding combat with bosses, but do they need to be so direct about it? In the first game you were told you could avoid the first encounter with Laura when an enemy burst through the door and left it open for you while Laura attacked him. Sure, Sebastian vaguely mentions running away as well, but in the heat of the moment it's far less noticeable. Here you're hit over the head with it. You don't get far before bumping into the boss again, except this time it can be temporarily killed with a few shots. Sebastian meets a woman called Hoffman, the Mobius psychologist sent into STEM. Hoffman is also the one responsible for devising the psychological exams that were supposed to keep psychopaths out of STEM. Stefano appears to meet that criteria, but he slipped through the cracks. Hoffman points out that people who know they are insane are often able to pass the test, so it appears to have a fairly critical flaw. It's like the US immigration question where they ask you if you're a terrorist. You'd have to be a fairly dumb one to actually tick that box. Hoffman states that the best way to annoy an artist like Stefano is to destroy his art. Sebastian leaves the marrow and goes to a new part of Union with the theatre where Stefano is holed up. The location of 2 of Stefano's works of art appear on your map, so you go to hunt them down. We're in a small open world again, so it's a good time to discuss the crafting and skill tree. A lot has changed from the first game, most of it for the better. I've gone on record in the past with my general dislike for crafting in video games. It's often implemented in such a lazy way that it feels like the developer is just checking a box on behalf of the publisher. Open world, check. RPG elements, check. Quick time events, check. Crafting, check. However, if there's one genre where crafting and collecting materials is a good fit, then that is the survival horror genre. Not only does the crafting and collecting avoid feeling like a chore, it actually improves upon the skill and levelling system from the first game. Just by way of a quick recap, in the first game you collected green gel and used it to expand all your abilities, from the number of bullets and matches you could carry to weapon damage and stamina. The sequel revamps this and is a huge improvement. As I mentioned earlier, you can find ammo pouches out in the world that increase the amount of ammo you can carry, so that's now out of the skill tree. Likewise, you can find machine parts which are used to upgrade your weapons to do more damage, increase your critical hit percentage, or unlock new abilities such as performing stealth kills under the cover of smoke. As with the first game, you should strongly consider upgrading the harpoon to set enemies on fire and probably increase the critical hit percentage for the pistol as well. You can also craft new ammo at the crafting stations. Gunpowder is the most useful resource, although some ammo types will require nails, smoke powder or fuses. You can also craft ammo while out in the field, but it will cost a lot more resources to do so. This strikes a good balance between allowing you to get out of tight situations while also encouraging preparation. There's a crafting station in most safe rooms, including Sebastian's, and there are a few dotted randomly around Union as well. With the weapon and ammo upgrades shunted off to the crafting table, the skill tree now has some genuinely interesting skills to select. The skills are split between stealth, combat, health, recovery, and athleticism. You can largely ignore the health and recovery options. You might want to increase your health bar a few times, but it's not essential. Stealth on the other hand is crucial, especially on the Nightmare difficulty setting. In the first game there were a few skills that were stupidly stingy until you upgraded them, and that's still the case here, although it's more subtle. Stamina is manageable from the start, although I'd still recommend increasing it at least once. Sebastian moves incredibly slowly while in stealth, so you should boost that as soon as possible or you'll barely be able to keep up with the enemy speed, let alone catch up with them for a stealth kill. Two other skills I'd recommend are Ambush, which allows you to do a stealth attack from cover so long as the enemy doesn't know where you are, and Bottle Break, which automatically uses a glass bottle, assuming you have one, to break free of most enemy grabs. Ambush is a touch inconsistent because Sebastian won't always stick to cover properly. Sebastian really should be able to get in cover against this piece of equipment, and it's the perfect spot for an ambush attack. Instead he just ducks down hopelessly and therefore can't initiate the attack. One skill I definitely don't recommend, especially given the heavy cost, is Predator. It sounds great on paper and I went for it immediately. Predator lets you sprint up to an enemy who has its back to you and get in a quick stealth kill. The catch is that you have to be less than 10 feet from the enemy, which means you're already up close anyway, plus it seems to only execute properly about half the time, and that's assuming you spot the tiny red arrow on the screen to activate it. A few times Sebastian would just go charging through the enemies and swing wildly, which is pretty much the opposite of what I intended to do. I successfully used this skill about 3 times and then gave up. It's not worth it. One final skill I'll mention is a bullet time thing that lets you slow down time to aim your shots. It's really expensive, but you can get it during your first playthrough if you save up for it. I didn't get it until New Game Plus. It's useful because with this skill you might actually be able to hit some enemies with the pistol. As you might well have noticed from the gameplay footage, I miss a lot of shots with the pistol. The Lost move around a hell of a lot and have a habit of dodging bullets like an overly caffeinated Neo. You need to predict where their head is going to move next, and more often than not you'll end up firing into thin air. There are 3 main reasons the aiming is so atrocious. One of them affects players across PC and console. One is less of a problem for PC players, and the final one is console only. The problem that affects everyone is the camera sensitivity being linked to the aiming sensitivity. You can't separate them, which means to have even remotely decent aiming sensitivity you'll have to have a camera that moves all over the place at the slightest touch. Even with the sensitivity all the way up, it's still nowhere near sufficient because the camera zooms in so much when Sebastian aims his gun. I'm hoping this can be fixed in a patch. There's really no need to be this zoomed in. The second problem is the hitboxes. It's incredibly hard to prove this conclusively because you can't see the exact frame on which I pulled the trigger, but I constantly felt like my bullets were going straight through enemies. This was a problem in the first game as well. At the very least, the hitboxes require incredibly precise aiming when I'd argue that perhaps they should be a bit more generous, especially on console. I doubt this problem is as bad using a mouse, but with the analog sticks it's a nightmare. I'm sure there'll be some arguments about how a hitbox bigger than the enemy wouldn't be realistic, or that the challenge is deliberate and you're supposed to miss shots because it's survival horror. Personally, I don't buy that. For some reason, the evil within requires you to be pinpoint accurate, and even that isn't always enough. Finally, there's the problem unique to console, or perhaps just PS4. If you only play on PC, then feel free to tune out for a bit. Go and download some driver updates or fiddle around with your V-Syncs and anti-aliasing. Now that the nerds have gone, the cool kids can talk about the terrible dead zones on the PS4 analog sticks. It's incredibly tough to move the reticule small distances. You'll either barely move it or it shoots across the screen. The aiming was so bad that I spent some time messing around with it after completing the game. I'm not all that technically minded when it comes to these things, so I don't know the correct terminology, but I'm hoping you can follow the gist of what I mean. The reticule movement isn't properly analog. It's more like using the D-pad. You don't have complete freedom of movement. When you move the stick, you're moving it left or right and up or down through a grid. Perhaps the best way to illustrate this is by showing what happens when I move the analog stick in a complete circle. As you can see, the reticule moves in a square. Even when moving the analog stick slower, there doesn't seem to be any way to move in a smooth circle. It's even more obvious when the aiming sensitivity is reduced. This jankiness can be felt when aiming because tiny movements don't register properly, especially if they aren't left, right, up or down. I wish I understood enough about game development to explain this by using the proper terminology, but I'm fairly sure this is what's happening. Either way, the analog stick aiming is terrible, and when combined with the speed at which enemies move, it's one of the worst shooting experiences I've had in a while. The problem isn't so bad with weapons like the shotgun that don't require the same amount of accuracy, and the ward and crossbow is a line of sight which helps you aim. The casual and survival difficulty modes have an aim assist option, perhaps specifically designed to counter this problem, but I don't like playing with aim assist, and it's far too generous here. Your aim locks onto enemies' heads and almost guarantees headshots. This removes much of the combat and ammo management challenge. I genuinely don't care if people want to use it, but I'd rather be able to aim my own gun with a reticule that moves in response to my commands. I'm aware that criticising the aiming sounds a lot like making excuses for not being good enough, but first of all, I've checked around online and this is a problem impacting a lot of players, not just me. And second, I don't particularly give a shit about how good or bad I am. My self-worth, or lack thereof, isn't dictated by my skills at video games. I'm far more rational than that. I base my value as a human being on more important things like the number of YouTube subscribers and Twitter followers I have. If you still think I just need to get good, then please feel free to mention it in the comments because, let's be honest, you're going to anyway. We've all seen the latest research paper from a certain well-respected university. Who am I to argue with the benefits of humble brags against such strong empirical evidence? If you want to read the full study, then there's a link in the description. I've also included a template humble brag in the description that you can use for this video and any other video I've made. Just replace the writing in the brackets with the appropriate content. I know you're busy and have a lot of YouTube comment sections to rage in before your mum calls you down for dinner. Hopefully this helps you save some time, and I can assure you I take the criticism to heart. Typically, telling me that you're better than me at a game, especially when done in the form of a humble brag, makes me rethink my opinion of the game and raise it 1 full star in my review. If you like a game more than me and can't handle someone else having a different opinion, then focusing on your superior skill is definitely the way to go to get a random stranger on the internet to change his mind. I apologise if this sounds sarcastic. I'm British, I can't help it. Okay, enough of that. This is the point where I'm going to suggest you stop watching and go play the game if you're at all interested. It might seem like I've already spoiled a lot, but there's plenty left, and as I said before, this is a good game. I recommend it. Once Sebastian finds Stefano's first painting, he goes to destroy it with a knife. I'm not sure if this line is deliberately funny, but I liked it regardless.
I'm gonna stab the shit out of you.
Once inside the painting, you move past some lost and then duck under some wires to get to the sculpture and destroy it. There was a similar scene at the end of the first game where you had to move under wires and the camera was a nightmare. It's much easier this time around. Your flashlight reveals the wires thanks to the much improved lighting and the new engine. Near the safe house is the body of a Mobius soldier who was waiting to be rescued by a woman called Stevens who has a key to a weapons storage room. You find Stevens later and of course she's already dead. She has a key on her which unlocks a room with a full-barreled shotgun that's decent for mid-range attacks. You then go into the second painting, except this time you have to sneak past Obscura again. You can take it on, but sneaking past is much easier and saves ammo of course. Once again you need to sneak under some wires and destroy a sculpture. With both of Stefano's works of art destroyed, you're now free to wander into the theatre. We get a tiny bit of backstory for Stefano where it's revealed he's a tortured artist desperate to be appreciated for his work. No big shock there. There's a grand confrontation in the theatre where Stefano explodes the heads of everyone in the room.
My latest creation. No!
It's another spectacular looking scene which is promptly followed up by a tedious stage where Sebastian has to avoid a set of slow moving lights. I've never enjoyed sections like this. They are rarely actual puzzles, just exercises in waiting patiently for a light to move so that you can run to the next piece of cover. The next time we bump into Stefano we get the chance to fight him for real. Stefano zips around quickly, teleporting around the room until he's close enough to stab you. He also throws a knife, but it's easy enough to dodge. What isn't easy is getting hits on him thanks to the aforementioned problems with aiming. With the shotgun it's not too bad, you just need to bait him in until he lunges for you, run out of the way and get a quick shot in. Aperture watches over the fight and will slam its tentacles down twice in quick succession if it spots you. Depending on where you happen to be at the time, either one or both of these attacks can be almost unavoidable. Stefano creates explosive slow time fields which will hit hard if you get caught by them, but that's the only time effect he uses. After all those cool slow-mo effects and cutscenes, I was really hoping for a more adventurous fight than this. I died twice to Stefano on my survival playthrough and about 4 times on Nightmare, which makes this the hardest boss in the game for me. It didn't feel like a particularly fair challenge as I felt like I was fighting the aiming sensitivity, not the boss. Sebastian kills the artist and is briefly reunited with Lily before Myra turns up. Myra walks into the room looking a lot like Ruvik, which was one hell of a tease. The likeness appears to either be a complete coincidence or just a lack of inspiration, because as far as I can tell there's no connection. Myra summons the goo monster, which takes her and Lily away. This is roughly the halfway point, so I'll take a quick detour to discuss an interesting side quest that is spread out over a couple of chapters. While exploring Union, you find a member of Mobius under attack from a bunch of Lost. The side quest doesn't start particularly smoothly. The Lost swarm over a fence, but when you burst through there's a forced cutscene and suddenly the enemies aren't there anymore, so yeah, there goes the tension. This would have been a lot better if Sykes, the Mobius agent, had shouted at you while you fought off the Lost, because it's fairly obvious what you need to do. Sykes asks you to reset some servers in the Marrow so that he can program software which he hopes will get him out of STEM. Sebastian agrees to help because getting the servers online also unlocks crates which contain additional resources. Sykes mentions that Mobius employees all have chips in their heads which supposedly make them immune to the negative effects of STEM. That will come into play later. A few chapters on, you bump into Sykes again, who asks you to kill a bunch of Lost so that he can reboot the power and get out of STEM. Sebastian is reluctant to go out of his way to help, but Sykes mentions that the pod might help him get Lily out of STEM as well. I love the effort the game goes to give Sebastian motivation to complete these tasks. He's on the hunt for his daughter, so he should be reluctant to do chores for others. However, the rewards from the locked crates are well worth collecting, and an escape route from STEM is obviously something that would be of interest to Sebastian. For all those worried about The Evil Within 2 being chock full of meaningless side quests, I can largely put your mind at rest. It's not. Once Sykes restarts the power, he climbs into one of those magic bathtubs and disappears. Only after he's gone does Sebastian find some Mobius notes, which state that the escape pod only has a 25% chance of success. It was part of an experiment, but the low success rate led to Mobius abandoning the project. We don't know exactly what happens to those who don't make it out alive, but it sounds like they are lost in sub-levels of STEM where they can no longer be tracked. This could just be a little throwaway line that isn't supposed to mean anything, but it could have a far deeper meaning that I will come to later. Anyway, this was a decent side quest which offered plenty of rewards, including a double-barreled shotgun. We're back in Sebastian's office, except this time there are a few differences, with candles and religious paraphernalia dotted around. The mirror transports him to an old ruin. He sees religious symbols that he recognises from the real world. We've seen the symbol before on the invitation near the beginning of the game. This is the cult masquerading as a religion, and not a particularly friendly one at that. There is a gruesome torture room and then a prison containing plenty of sleeping Lost. You'd be well advised to kill these Lost while they're behind bars because, as you might expect, the doors will open soon enough. Sebastian is taunted by a mysterious figure, and then there's one of those fairly cool scenes where gravity shifts around as he falls. I'm a sucker for these. Writing on the wall taunts Sebastian for his failure to save his daughter and for not believing his wife. I'm also a sucker for visual effects like this one where the brick wall opens up. You're then thrown up against a new enemy called the Disciples. When they're in flame on mode you can't stealth kill them, but so long as you get the timing right they'll go down in one attack. Not that stealth attacks are much good at this point. There's 3 of them in a small room with you, so you're best off just piling ammo into them. Later on, freeze bolts and ice canisters will be an effective weapon against them. After completing a basic dial puzzle that feels straight out of an Uncharted game, you finally meet the mysterious figure who's been taunting you. It's a man known as Father Theodore, the head of this mysterious cult that Mobius used to bring in STEM recruits. Mobius realised that a fake religion with volunteers would be an easier way to get people into STEM compared to kidnapping them. The threat and menace of this big boss figure was somewhat diminished when I realised that Theodore is the long-form version of Ted. So this guy is Father Ted, and I couldn't stop referring to him as that throughout the entire game. Theodore wants the core for himself. He knows where Myra is, but he won't tell Sebastian until Sebastian agrees to join his cause. Obviously that isn't going to happen anytime soon. Sebastian is hit by a wave of blood and wakes up to see an image of Lily standing over him. The woman in the background firing an assault rifle is officially called Torres, but for most of my first playthrough I referred to her as downloadable content. If we do get DLC for The Evil Within 2, I am fairly sure it will be for Torres. As we'll see, she keeps herself busy during the events of this game and seems like a strong contender for extra content. You fight alongside Torres to defend the cabin from waves of Lost. While I have mentioned some complaints with the game's combat, this scene is much smoother than a similar one in the original game and reminded me that everything does feel better this time around. It's also somewhat reminiscent of a scene from another highly regarded survival horror game, but let's not worry about that too much. There's an exposition dump as you head towards Torres' safe house. Torres explains that she's been working with Kidman and Myra to get Lily out of STEM. This is when Sebastian finally realises that Myra has been working with Mobius. It's a touch awkward from a storytelling perspective, as we've known that Myra worked for Mobius since the end of the first game's DLC. Myra found out Lily wasn't dead and worked to take down Mobius from the inside. I'll talk more about this setup later in the video. Theodore was also part of the plan to get Lily back, but he betrayed them. There are more disciples to kill before you make it into Torres' hideout. The plan created by Torres, Kidman, Theodore and Myra wasn't just about getting Lily out of STEM. They wanted to take Mobius down with it. As Sykes mentioned earlier, Mobius employees have chips in their heads to make them immune from the effects of STEM. Myra plans to send a signal back to Mobius as a form of mass lobotomy. Sebastian heads back to Hoffman and sees an image of her being called away. The image of Hoffman goes through a door that won't open for Sebastian because he doesn't have one of Mobius's chips in his head. Conveniently, there's a dead Mobius employee nearby, so you take the chip from his head and make it through the door. Hoffman was heading to meet up with O'Neill, but it's a trap. O'Neill has succumbed to Theodore's preaching and is now a flamethrower-wielding Harbinger. Hoffman is locked in a room and it's up to Sebastian to kill O'Neill. It's another boss fight that doesn't require much more than running away and turning to shoot occasionally. Instead of explosive barrels, there are freeze canisters that deal decent damage if you time it right. O'Neill's flamethrower covers the arena in fire, but there are a couple of sprinkler systems you can activate to put the fires out. The smoke bolts are useful here to get in stealth kills. You can destroy O'Neill's weapon, but he gets pretty aggressive with the melee attacks, so I wouldn't recommend it. A minor annoyance is that there's no animation in response to your shots. You can shoot him in the head and he doesn't so much as flinch. Even a slight flick of the head would have been appreciated. You defeat O'Neill and get a deathbed confession. He made a machine for Theodore and tells you to destroy it. The machine is just a short walk away. I wondered whether there was some cut content here, but it's possible this is going to be expanded in the Torres DLC I'm hoping we get. Sebastian calls her in to help as she's the explosives expert and she shows up rather suddenly. Maybe we'll act out this part of the journey in the DLC. Of all the Mobius employees we've met, Torres is the best fit for DLC. She used to be in the military and was contracted out to Mobius. After leaving the military, she went to work for Mobius full time. She can also use guns, whereas the others are fairly useless in that department. I can imagine playing as her. Strangely, you can talk to Torres about Hoffman even though Hoffman is standing right behind you. Awkward. I skipped a fairly significant part of the last chapter, so let's revisit that before carrying on with the story. Early on in the game, you encounter a ghostly figure called Anima. When Anima appears, the air goes icy cold and all other enemies despawn. You have to avoid the ghost until the air returns to normal and she disappears. If the ghost catches you, then it's an instant one-hit kill. These scenes can be tense, especially when you're trapped in a small space. The ones that take place out in the open are a bit pointless as the ghost moves slowly and it's easy to keep your distance. Best of all, if you're playing on PS4, the ghost's voice comes out through the speaker on the controller. The first time I heard that was one of the few genuinely scary moments in the game. In one of your meetings with Anima, you'll walk back to Beacon Mental Hospital and have to use a mirror to identify which door to head through. There's much more to these encounters than just cheap tension. Just to take a step back, Mobius has been recruiting people via its fake religion and the Mu spirituality tests. With the help of Father Theodore, who was an excellent motivational speaker, Mobius picks those who are susceptible and encourages them to disown their family, which in turn reduces the amount of missing person reports generated for the victims. The victims are given memory wipes and then thrown into Union. In order to reduce the stress on people's minds, Mobius made Union feel like a real city, with fake mayoral elections and bureaucracy because, let's be honest, we'd know we were living in a dream world if we suddenly didn't have to deal with paperwork. Everything was going smoothly, but then people started turning into Lost. It was rare and affected about 0.05% of people. Enough for Mobius to be concerned. Mobius started conducting tests and assumed that the transformation had something to do with the memory wipes given to people before entering STEM. That's not it. There's a missable encounter early in the game where you meet a woman who thinks she's seen a ghost and is being haunted. She's having weird thoughts of another life and knows she doesn't belong in Union. You can also find diary entries where people talk about seeing a figure that no one else can see. Obviously the ghost is Anima. When Anima catches people, they turn into Lost. We see this right back at the beginning of the game when a priest turns into a Lost before our eyes. We don't see Anima kill the priest, but it looks like he's having his soul sucked from his body in much the same way Sebastian does when Anima catches him. There's also a flicker that suggests Sebastian is turning into a Lost just before the screen fades to black. Mobius tries to keep the disease contained, but it eventually spreads to Mobius employees, even though they haven't had the memory wipes. One of the first to be infected is the guy who works in the pit where the bodies are disposed of. When the core went missing, the disease spread rapidly and now nearly everyone has turned into Lost. There's a decent boss battle with Anima. You can't fight her directly, but running from her is an impressive spectacle. Anima moves the cover around during the fight and keeps you on your toes. Sebastian then comes face to face with his body from the first game and realises that a part of him is still trapped in STEM. I assume he's referring to the STEM from the first game, because otherwise this wouldn't make much sense. He kills this other version of himself without any hesitation and immediately feels better. He's also rewarded with the trusty revolver he used in the first game. So who is this ghost? Anima definitely resembles Laura, Ruvik's dead sister, but I can't find anything in the game that confirms or even suggests this beyond her appearance. I'd be prepared to write it off as a coincidence, but Myra looks a lot like Ruvik when she first appears. This is either incredibly uninspired art design or there's something deeper going on. At the end of Sykes' side quest, we find out that there are deeper layers of STEM that Mobius can't monitor. I think that's where Anima comes from, or perhaps you're transported there when you encounter her, which would explain why other enemies despawn. My weak theory with absolutely no support is that this deep layer of STEM contains traces of Ruvik. That's why the ghost resembles Laura and Myra resembles Ruvik. The ghost side story is missable, however it's another good example of side content that rewards the player with both resources and information about the world. This is how it should be done. Sebastian's next random change in location takes him to a dingy underground area where he needs to follow Lily's signal. There's nothing much to see here, although it's worth pointing out these big enemies that explode near you and do a lot of damage. There was a similar enemy in the DLC, but those ones were easier to avoid and you could predict when they will blow. You're best off shooting these ones from a distance or never getting close to them in the first place. Sebastian is once again taunted by visions of Lily and meets Father Theodore.
You are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. Unless you join.
Sebastian ends up shooting Torres by mistake, and to be fair, she did show up somewhat unexpectedly. She's obviously not too badly injured because after a fade to black we see Torres fighting off Lost with her assault rifle. Sebastian then wakes up in his old house and finds the letter from Myra that we saw in the first game. Myra pops up and there's some clunky dialogue where she tries to convince Sebastian that it wasn't his fault. He appears to finally accept that he isn't to blame. Next he's in one of the safe rooms with Hoffman. Torres is dead. She died due to injuries sustained from fighting the Lost, not from Sebastian shooting her, but nevertheless he blames himself. So within seconds of Sebastian accepting that this isn't all his fault, he's back to blaming himself. It's all a little tedious and is especially awkward because there was none of this in the first game, where he never so much as mentioned his wife and child. I'm not sure what this means for my theory of Torres being a DLC character. I'm probably way off base, but this ending to her story makes me even more hopeful that we will get to play as her. The DLC could start with her infiltrating a Mobius STEM lab to get inside STEM with Myra and Theodore. We could then see how she finds Sebastian and brings him back to the cabin before blowing up the stable field emitter and then saving Sebastian from the Lost. The DLC could end with her death. It's not all that common to have a player character die, but it could work in a short piece of DLC. It happened with the Executioner, the third piece of DLC for The Evil Within. Or perhaps she's not really dead. I'm not sure what motivation Hoffman has for lying, but it's not like Sebastian checks her pulse or examines her thoroughly. Torres was the one who kidnapped Lily from Sebastian's house all those years ago. That could even be the start of the DLC, although kidnapping a child might be a touch dark, even for a game like The Evil Within. I have another thought related to the DLC, but it will make more sense to discuss it at the end. Anyway, destroying the machine means that Theodore's location is no longer hidden. However, he's surrounded by fire and it's impossible to get to him. Hoffman has an idea, but she needs some time to put together a machine to help them get through the fire. In the meantime, Sebastian goes back into Union to finish off the side quests with Sykes that I've already discussed. There are quite a few of the Harbinger enemies around Union now, although they aren't quite as tough to take down as O'Neill's boss version. I really dislike when boss enemies are then paraded out as regular enemies. Eventually you meet up with Hoffman again after she's fixed the stabilizer device. This device creates a protective shield helping you move through the fire. You get attacked by more Divine along the way, however Hoffman has plenty of ammo on hand and there are medkits to pick up as well. The device occasionally stops working, but Hoffman's able to keep it going until Sebastian makes it to safety. Hoffman doesn't join him. She's captured and is presumably killed. This means that out of the 5 Mobius technicians sent into STEM, only Sykes is potentially made out alive and his chances don't look great. Sebastian moves through Theodore's lair until he reaches a room full of Divine. It looks a lot tougher than it is. The Divine can all be stealth killed while not in flame on mode, and it's not too difficult to take them on one at a time without others spotting you. You don't even need to kill them all, you just need to open a door. I ended up getting a touch bored with the stealth takedowns, so I used some of the conveniently placed freeze canisters to take a couple out. When you finally reach Theodore, he once again tries to taunt Sebastian with memories from his past and throws him back into Beacon Mental Hospital for a mini boss rush mode. Given that I had plenty of ammo and was familiar with the bosses from the first game, this ended up being pretty easy. A lack of challenge is usually a criticism in a survival horror game, but I enjoyed the brief moment of strength and power. It was my reward for hunting down every last piece of scrap. I also went out of my way to kill 2 harbingers to get the materials I needed to repair the flamethrower. This then made short work of Laura, who is weak to fire. At the end, Theodore yells, "What are you?" in shock at Sebastian's performance, and it felt good. I felt powerful, as if I had personally helped Sebastian overcome his demons. This moment wouldn't have felt as special if I'd died 13 times while facing off against the bosses. Of course, it says something when the game's best boss fights are recycled content from the last game. You never fight Theodore directly. Myra shows up and kills him for you. Myra wants to keep Lily safe and believes that means staying inside STEM. She destroys the building and Union starts falling apart even more so than it already was. There's a new enemy type ahead. They're like regular Lost except more aggressive in hunting you down. If you have the ambush skill, you can use this to your advantage by luring them to your hiding place and doing a stealth kill. I got the distinct impression at this stage that the game had run out of ideas for making the combat sections challenging. This goes for the boss fights as well. Effigy looks incredible with an electrical pole stuck through its body which makes it immune to shock damage. It's certainly not immune to explosive damage though, and you can probably guess where you're supposed to aim. It can slam down the electrical pole for AoE shock damage, but it isn't a difficult fight. Myra destroys the city and Sebastian wakes up in an area that looks like a desert with a white filter over the top. It's a cool image, and the long slog to the house on the top of the hill is a fitting way to approach the climax. While the game is perhaps a touch too long, I'm happy with the pacing throughout. There's a good mix of narrow linear sections, open world areas, combat challenges and slow paced exploration. We've just had a load of boss fights and now we get a slow chapter where Sebastian moves through a series of memories showing Myra, Kidman, Theodore and Torres putting the plan into action. Union was running so smoothly that Mobius wasn't paying attention to it. This perhaps explains how 3 people were able to sneak their way into STEM, because I've been struggling with that part, especially since they all have chips in their heads. Torres goes into STEM first and Myra follows after, knowing that for her it is a one-way trip. Theodore then betrays them. He wants to control the core because control of the core means control of Mobius and therefore control of the world. Myra tells Lily to run and hide, which presumably brings us to the point where the game started and the core went missing. Stefano hunted down Lily on behalf of Theodore. Sebastian meets up with Myra, but she's still determined to keep Lily within STEM. She sees that as the only way to keep Lily safe from Mobius. This throws us into the final boss battle. It's another impressive looking boss that is somewhat ruined by a rather obvious weak spot in the middle. After a few hits, spiders come out to attack Sebastian, but you can stomp on them to get ammo and health packs. A similar mechanic was used in the first game. Myra slams her fists down, but the attacks are incredibly easy to avoid if you have your stamina leveled up a few times. The second phase is a bit tougher as she's more aggressive, however it's still an easy fight. I prefer this to the quick time event that was the first game's final boss, although it isn't as visually impressive. Myra doesn't die. She rises from the goo and insists Sebastian go to the house by himself to get Lily. I'd resigned myself to the gameplay being over at this point, but the game had one final surprise in store. When Sebastian opens the door to the house, we transition smoothly to Kidman at what I assume is Mobius HQ. She's apparently the only one who thinks Mobius does casual Fridays. The administrator, who's the head of Mobius, at least as far as we know, orders Kidman to extract the core and kill Sebastian, but she refuses. Kidman ends up in a shootout which I highly recommend you blaze through without thinking too much. If you pause, you realise that the Mobius agents have literally zero AI and act like enemies in a time crisis game. There's another door transition and we're back to Sebastian as he grabs Lily and heads to the exit. Myra shows up and explains the final part of the plan. She's not leaving. Myra is going to become the core and send out a signal to take out all the Mobius employees via the chips in their heads. Sebastian tries to convince her to leave with him, but she correctly points out that Mobius will just hunt them down and Lily will never be safe. As with much of the game, the dialogue isn't great, but it's a touching scene nonetheless.
STEM is more than just this place. All of Mobius are connected to it via the chips in their heads. Once I assume the power of the core, I can transmit a signal just as Union collapses. A signal that can take Mobius down once and for all.
We're finally together again.
There's no other choice. This is part of the plan. It always has been. I'm sorry.
There's another transition and we're back to Kidman in a gunfight. She starts to bring Sebastian out of STEM and we flick back to Sebastian, who is heading to his safe room with Lily. We go back to Kidman as the administrator berates her and tries to kill her via the chip in her head. It doesn't work. She removed it 3 days ago. Sebastian makes it to the mirror and gets out of STEM. Myra prepares the signal, Kidman activates it, and all the Mobius employees are killed, including the administrator. Sebastian removes Lily from the core and they walk off. An epilogue shows Sebastian dropping Kidman off somewhere before they drive away. Kidman removes the random glove she's been wearing for the entire game, and we see the scar that appeared when she left STEM after the first game. Sebastian doesn't have the bandage on his hand anymore, but we can't see if there's a scar. If you remember from my first video, I theorised that the scar was a mark left by Ruvik on those who entered STEM. The way both Sebastian and Kidman had their left hands covered for the entire game makes me think Tango Gameworks wanted to drop this part of the story, but if so, why show it here at the end? I suppose it could be a teaser for the next game, but it must be confusing as hell for those who didn't play the DLC for the first game. Speaking of teasers for the next game, assuming there is one, we see the STEM computer boot back up. I'm hoping this is Ruvik and not Myra. And that's it, the end of the game. The Evil Within 2's story is much more straightforward than its predecessors, however there are still a few parts that don't make a lot of sense to me. As with the first game, most of my problems centre around the start and the overall premise. Lily was kidnapped in 2012, 2 years before the events of the first game. The whole point of the first game was that the STEM system with Ruvik at the core was crucial to Mobius's experiments. If they already had Lily, then they shouldn't have needed Ruvik's brain at all. They should have shut it down the second he started trying to take control. Then we have Myra. She was an excellent detective and thought there was something fishy about her daughter's supposed death. She discovered Mobius and ended up working for them. This doesn't add up. She's not working undercover. In the first game's DLC, we hear Myra referred to by her first name. I'm sure Mobius would have been suspicious if a person called Myra began working there after they kidnapped the child of a woman named Myra. In addition, Torres mentions that she went to Myra to help in the fight against Mobius because she felt bad about taking Lily in the first place. That means Myra's identity and relationship to Lily must have been common knowledge within Mobius. So if that's the case, why on earth would Mobius hire her? Even if they think she's brainwashed, you have to assume they would keep an eye on her. That's almost certainly a plot hole, but it's also one I can let slide. Not every plot hole has a devastating effect on the plot. We already know that the Lily and Myra story was added to the first game late in development, so these kind of issues are bound to pop up. After the first game, Mobius stepped up recruitment through a fake religion headed up by Theodore, who was a powerful motivational speaker. With Lily as the core, Mobius set up a tranquil STEM environment based on a quiet American town called Union. Everything ran smoothly for a while. Myra worked with Kidman, Torres and Theodore to come up with a plan to free Lily and finish off Mobius for good. They go into STEM with Mobius completely unaware. Whenever we see the physical STEM equipment, it always looks like a small room with a lot of oversight and monitoring. However, given that there are a lot of people in Union, it seems safe to assume that there are huge rooms full of STEM pods somewhere. Perhaps these rooms have less monitoring and the crew could sneak in. Again, it's a bit of a stretch, but I can roll with it. Torres heads into STEM, closely followed by Myra and Theodore. Kidman stays behind to keep an eye on things. Perhaps she messes with the data to stop Mobius noticing what's going on. Once inside, they find Lily, but Theodore betrays them. Myra tells Lily to run and hide, and Theodore gets Stefano to find her. I'm not sure if Theodore recruited Stefano before he went into STEM, or if he used his power while in STEM to influence him. We saw Theodore corrupt O'Neill pretty easily, so either way seems possible. With Lily missing, Union starts falling apart, and we reach the start of the game. From here it's pretty straightforward. Sebastian goes after Stefano to get Lily, but by this point Myra has started to go a bit crazy. She takes Lily. Theodore knows where Lily is, but he refuses to tell Sebastian. Sebastian tracks Theodore down, Myra kills him, and Sebastian goes after Myra to get Lily. That's really all there is to it. For better or worse, the story is simple this time. There are still a few unresolved issues that bother me. Neither Kidman nor Myra made any effort to contact Sebastian in the 3 years since Beacon Mental Hospital. I suppose the rationale for this is that they were being watched, but it doesn't sit right with me. If Mobius was that concerned with Sebastian, they would have had him killed. It's not like he was in hiding. Was there really no way to get a message to him? Myra and Kidman managed to concoct a plan to take Mobius down without Mobius knowing, so clearly Mobius isn't a big all-seeing eye. Mobius also doesn't seem to care that Kidman lied to them about Sebastian being dead at the end of the first game. She clearly indicated that Sebastian was dead to allow him to escape, and yet they found out he was alive. Mobius looks frankly inept at this point. Kidman and Sebastian have a lot of personal conversations while he's in STEM. Dotted around the world are slides that represent Sebastian's memories, and he stops to discuss them with Kidman. I don't understand how they're having these conversations. Time in STEM moves differently to time in the real world. The events of the first game took place in just 37 real-world minutes, and Hoffman reiterates this point in the game. So how are they able to talk in real time? I also don't understand why she can talk to Sebastian and yet can't do the same with the Mobius employees, who are apparently cut off even though they have communicators. Speaking of these conversations, the final slide is about Joseph, and it's confirmed that he's alive. This is the obvious candidate for DLC, but I'm sticking with Torres for my bet. Joseph's absence is a bit annoying, and this brief acknowledgement that he's alive strongly implies that Tango Gameworks doesn't know what they want to do with him. I'm also a touch confused about those who can control STEM and act as the core. Stefano is a psychopath, and we know they can control STEM, but how are Theodore and Myra doing it? They clearly have a lot of power in STEM, but they don't fit the typical profile. Myra's plan was always to stay in STEM and turn its power against Mobius by using the chips in the employee's head. If that's the case, then Torres and Theodore would also have been killed even if they had escaped. I suppose they could have quickly removed their chips. Sykes, on the other hand, might be in trouble. He only had a 25% chance of making it out alive anyway. If he did make it, I hope he took his chip out damn quickly. My final concern is not a plot hole necessarily, just an observation. Lily was captured in 2012 at the age of 5.5. She should now be at least 10 years old, but she appears to be the same age as when she was taken. I guess the STEM system stops you from aging, in which case Mobius could have made a fortune from selling skin cream and taken over the world that way. I have no idea how Sebastian's going to explain Lily's reappearance when she hasn't aged. He needs to be careful or he's going to end up on a list. I mentioned earlier that there's possibly a good idea for story DLC with Torres if she's somehow still alive. She could pop up right at the end and offer to take over the core in place of Myra. She still feels guilty about kidnapping Lily, so it would fit thematically, and this could bring Myra back into the story if that's what Tango wants to do. If not, I'm fine with the ending as it stands. Then we have Nurse Tatiana. In the first game, we discovered that she was Leslie's nurse, and she was present in the safe room which was created by Leslie's mind. At the end of the DLC, it was revealed that Tatiana was also part of Mobius. Presumably, she still is. Tatiana might be the person Kidman was referring to when she said there was someone in there for Sebastian, or it could be Torres or Myra. Sebastian thinks it's Myra based on his earlier reaction, but Kidman never confirms it either way. Come to think of it, I have no idea why Kidman didn't tell Sebastian that Myra was in STEM. He was bound to find out. Tatiana does make some cryptic comments about her identity, but they're so vague that I suspect Tango Gameworks hasn't decided who exactly she is yet. There's a hint that she's important to Sebastian, but then why wouldn't he recognise her? The most interesting part of the story is what's not here. There's no Ruvik. With the exception of the mark on Kidman's hand and Myra's appearance when she first shows up, there's no reference to Ruvik at all here. This is disappointing on so many levels. I spent hours unravelling the mystery surrounding Ruvik and understanding his character and motivations. I hope the sequel would show what he'd gotten up to in the last few years. He might come back in the third game, assuming there is one, but are we supposed to believe he's been hanging around in the real world not doing anything for 3 years? Or even 6 years by the time the third game comes out? There does appear to be a link between the church in the first game and the religion that Mobius uses to recruit new people into STEM, however it's tenuous at best. A few levels in the first game took place in and underneath the church. The location was important to both Ruvik and Kidman, with the church even popping up again in Kidman's DLC. When I saw the religious theme in the trailer for the sequel, I hoped that it would tie in nicely with the first game and maybe even delve into Kidman's backstory a bit more. No such luck. There's no explicit connection, however on closer inspection there does appear to be a link. The two religions have a similar logo. The one in the first game is encased within a circle, but there are clear similarities. This is yet another issue that I don't believe Tango Gameworks has decided what it wants to do with. The symbols are technically different, so it could be that the Moose Center was pretending to be a splinter group of the religion from the first game, or perhaps a slightly different variation on the same thing, like Protestants and Catholics both being part of Christianity. However, the symbols are similar enough that if Tango Gameworks decides to develop this further, it can pretend that the two groups are linked. I don't believe there's enough information in the game to know for sure. The Evil Within 2 is also missing the attention to detail that hooked me in with the original. In the first game, there was a reason why every enemy looked the way they did. The Haunted with Two Heads were the result of people with dual identity disorder being sent into STEM. The enemies in the water represented people who had drowned inside STEM. Laura was Ruvik's sister who died in a fire. All of the bosses took on appearances based on Ruvik's mind or people who had entered STEM, such as the Keeper who represented Ruvik's desire to keep secrets after Jimenez stole from him, or the Giants who were twins experimented on by a sadistic church near Ruvik's home. Everything had a meaning. It was all there for a reason. Let's compare that to the sequel. Stefano is the first main bad guy we're chasing. His backstory is bare bones. He lost his eye while working as a photographer in a war zone where he found beauty in death. Theodore isn't much better. We don't see him until 2/3 of the way through the game, and he doesn't have much of a backstory either. Where do the bosses come from? Obscura is clearly a creation of Stefano, but all of the others feel rather random. 3 of them are variations of goo-based monstrosities with obvious glowing red hitboxes. Other than the goo being linked to the STEM machinery, there doesn't seem to be any particularly deep meaning about this recurring theme. If you're going to repeat enemy types so often, you need a damn good reason for it. Myra summoned the goo monster at one point, but I can't find any reason why that would be. Now sure, the first game left a lot of questions for its DLC, but that was more about filling in plot holes or gaps in the story. This is background information that has been excluded from the game, whereas last time it was included in notes and menus. It could be that there's a good reason for every enemy to be the way it is, and that information just hasn't been included. However, I have a bad feeling that no such information exists. There's also no information about Anima. Anima could be a reference to Carl Jung, in which case it would be a representation of repressed male sensitivity. That doesn't quite fit though, because she appeared to both men and women. The non-boss enemies don't have much in the way of explanations. What's the deal with the lament? What are the hysterics screaming about? Did we really need a load of identical flamethrower enemies? The lack of attention to detail leaves the world feeling rather flat by comparison to the first game. I'm not prepared to definitively say that the developers haven't gone to the same level of effort to create backstories and rationales for the enemies, but they certainly didn't bother to put it in the game. The first Evil Within had 2 difficulty settings on the first playthrough, casual and survival. I found survival to be a decent but far from insurmountable challenge on a first playthrough. Part of the challenge was dealing with the game's general jank and terrible hitboxes. After completing the game, you opened up Nightmare and Akumu difficulties. At first glance, the sequel appears to have the same settings with a couple of minor differences. The Nightmare setting is unlocked from the start, and Akumu has been renamed as Classic Mode. Classic Mode restricts the number of saves you can make and is really tough, at least to me. You know if you're the sort of gamer who wants to complete the game on Classic difficulty. I'm not one of those people. When I play games with difficulty settings, I nearly always do my first playthrough on the normal difficulty because I see that as the way the game was intended to be played. Having played on survival last time, I didn't give it a second thought this time around. There were 3 settings, so I chose the middle one, survival. If you enjoyed the challenge of the first game, if you're generally a decent gamer, then don't do what I did. Choose Nightmare. You don't even need to take my word for it. The game tells you if you bother to take the time to look, which I stupidly didn't. Nightmare is described as the ideal setting for those who enjoyed the challenge of the previous game. You're not being lied to. If you like a challenge, then you should start on Nightmare. Survival is a touch too easy, especially if you're exploring the open world areas to collect all the materials and weapons. It's almost like the difficulty is set on the assumption that you won't be exploring the open world. If you do, you'll rarely struggle for ammo and will be able to make plenty of upgrades to your weapons. That's fine. If you take the time to explore, then you should be rewarded with supplies. My real issue is that the lack of challenge is mainly down to the poor enemy AI, which makes the stealth feel far more overpowered than it otherwise should. In short, the enemies are incredibly dumb, have terrible eyesight and even worse memories. If you're spotted by an enemy, just run away and hide behind a nearby wall or crate. They will quickly lose sight of you and won't bother to do much in the way of checking to see where you might have gone. They'll potter on back to their previous routine and you can try again. If there's a group of enemies, you'll be able to sneak up on one enemy, get a stealth kill and then run from the other enemies who spot you. Then go back, kill another one and repeat. This feels especially silly when you have enemies who can't be killed with one stealth attack, like the hysterics or laments. You go in for one hit, run behind a box and then go back for the second. The Harbinger enemies with the flamethrowers do at least appear to learn from their mistakes. Getting one stealth attack in is easy enough, but as far as I could tell they will always spot you when you go in for a second. Coupled with all this is the overabundance of health and restoration items. In addition to finding health packs in the environment, you can also craft them on the fly or at workbenches with herbs, and can even drink coffee at safe rooms to regenerate full health. The coffee takes 20 minutes to refill between drinks, which sounds like a long time, but you can easily go out into the world, kill some enemies, take a few hits and then go back. And if it's not ready, you just wait. Some of the open world levels have multiple safe rooms and therefore multiple coffee cups to drink from. There's also a lack of traps this time around. I have mixed feelings about this. The traps in the first game probably annoyed a lot of people, but I thought they were quite fun. I don't mind the odd instant death so long as there's a nearby save point. The traps are a feature of the first game and their absence here makes this feel like an entirely different experience. Whether that's for better or worse is up to you to decide. So with all that said, Nightmare is the best difficulty setting for veterans of survival horror games or just halfway decent gamers. It starts off tough, but after you've spent some time in the open world, you should be fine. I have a couple of caveats to this recommendation, however. First, I haven't completed the game on Nightmare. I got about 2/3 of the way through and made it past the section where you walk through the flames, which is the last point I remember thinking would be tough on Nightmare. I then overwrote my save file and autosaves with my New Game Plus playthrough and lost over 4 hours of gameplay. I haven't found the enthusiasm to go back. It seemed to be getting easier as I played, and I haven't read about any horrible difficulty spikes that would change my mind. More importantly, playing on Nightmare means you'll almost certainly have to take your time and explore the open world levels. That's what you really should be doing anyway, because there's some good content in there. If you preferred the linear style of the first game and want to treat the sequel in the same way, then you're going to have a tougher time. Finally, beware of the lack of save points in the open world levels. On my Nightmare run, I spent a while taking out one of the Harbingers because I wanted to get the spare parts to fix the flamethrower. I killed it and proceeded to take out 3 Divines, collect some spare parts from a dead Mobius employee, kill a few of the exploding enemies, and then try to take out another Harbinger. I failed and had to restart just after the first Harbinger I killed. This was annoying enough by itself, as I had spent a good 20 minutes since the last save, but it was made even worse when I didn't notice that I had to pick up the flamethrower part again. I got what I thought was my second piece and tried to repair the flamethrower. Upon noticing I didn't have the second piece, I had to go back to the first area and find the flamethrower part, which is now in a completely different location for some reason. As you can tell, I'm still bitter about this. Autosaves are wildly inconsistent throughout. I had an autosave trigger about 10 seconds into a boss fight, as if doing that 10 seconds again would have been a big problem. Conversely, I had to go through a cutscene a couple of times when I kept getting killed by the lost that crawl on the floor. So yeah, if you're on Nightmare, try not to die too much. Don't say I never give helpful advice. Despite playing on what was probably the wrong difficulty for me, I still had a lot of fun with the game. Sure, the survival element of this survival horror game was somewhat lacking, but the weapons and tools at your disposal in The Evil Within 2 are entertaining to use regardless of the challenge involved. I didn't feel as tense as I did when playing the last game, but I still had a great time. There's a whole bunch of stuff I want to comment on that I couldn't find a natural place to include in a video. There are new voice actors for Sebastian and Kidman. I don't know why they felt the need to change this up, because the new actors don't seem to be an improvement on the last ones. Perhaps the original actors are too expensive now. It's hard to comment on the quality of the acting, as the script isn't even good as a schlocky B-movie. It's dry and bland, with the emotional scenes being among the bigger culprits. It's also annoying how Sebastian keeps acting confused the whole time. He's seen weird shit like this before. He shouldn't be saying "wait, what?" every 10 seconds.
What the hell is going on?
When you complete the game, you get some new outfits for Sebastian, a set of brass knuckles, and the ability to play the game in letterbox mode, which is described as offering a cinematic experience. I love this jokey little reference to one of the more controversial elements of the last game. What I don't like is all the Easter eggs for other Bethesda games. Littered around the world are figures of Corvo's mask from Dishonored, the Skyrim Online logo, Doom Guy, a Panzerhound from Wolfenstein, a Fallout bobblehead, a Talos 1 mug from Prey, a Keeper enemy from the first Evil Within, and a rocket launcher from Quake. Each item has a little bit of text stating that you think you recognise the object from somewhere but can't figure out where. The objects you've collected are then stored in your office. This probably seems like harmless fun, and I suppose it is, but I get the impression these objects are here as a Bethesda mandate instead of it being a decision by Tango Gameworks. Bethesda is desperate to tie in all of its franchises for brand loyalty. Quake Champions already has BJ and Doomslayer in it, and I wouldn't be surprised if more characters pop up there. Bethesda is trying to create the kind of brand loyalty that Blizzard enjoys. Of course, I could be wrong, but the second this thought entered my mind, it soured the experience of collecting these random Easter eggs. One thing you don't get on completion is a chapter select. As someone who is missing just one document out of about 40, this is absolutely infuriating. The documents aren't as revealing this time around, so there's likely nothing important on it, but the completionist in me wants the full collection. I purchased The Evil Within 2 about 4 hours before release, so it technically counted as a pre-order. That means I got a few goodies as bonus items, including a blast pistol, a medical kit, and some herbs. This all gets added to your inventory immediately, which means right from the start the game has been made a touch easier just because of the time at which you purchased the game. I hate this crap. Fortunately, the blast pistol is fairly useless, so you won't use it much anyway unless you really hate having ammo. I could have done without the extra health items though. There's a gun range now for you to practice your shooting, but for me it just served as another reminder of how bloody bad it is. If you're playing on PC, this is probably a cool minigame. If you're using a controller, then the bonus items you can win aren't worth the time. I've been critical of the lack of attention to detail, but there are plenty of nice touches that are worth highlighting. For example, you can find 2 of Lily's dolls, one of her and one of Myra, and then at the end she has a doll of Sebastian that she kept with her the entire time. I also appreciated the references to Sebastian undergoing counselling, only to find out that the counsellor and police chief were working for Mobius. The stealth attack animations have also been improved, although Sebastian still sometimes jolts up into a standing position and back down into a crouch, even though he was crouched to begin with. I have no idea why this bothers me so much, but it does. The open worlds have waypoints to head to, which can lead to the UI getting a touch messy. If you like, you can turn the numbers off and just use the numbers on Sebastian's communicator, which conveniently show you how close you are to your destination. Matches played a crucial role in the first game and have been removed entirely from this one. I enjoyed the challenge of using the matches at just the right time, hoping to burn 3 or 4 enemies and save a bunch of precious ammo. Instead of matches, there's a stomp mechanic that actually works this time around. If you down an enemy, you can run up to them and finish them off with your boot. This is especially effective when combined with puddles and shock bolts, although shooting them in the leg to get them to fall over doesn't work so well this time around. Unfortunately, you can't stomp on enemies who are sleeping or playing dead, which annoys me no end. If you can tell an enemy is about to get up, you should be able to kill it without wasting ammo and waking it up. It should be a reward for being alert. Finally, I want to give a shout out to the excellent cover of Ordinary World by The Hit House. I loved it in the trailer, but it's even better at the end of the game. It's a perfect way to end the game, and on that note, I should wrap up this video. The Evil Within 2 is a much easier game to recommend than its predecessor. I'm convinced a wider range of people will enjoy it. There are fewer bugs, fewer cheap deaths, a more straightforward story, and smoother combat both with weapons and in stealth. To use a phrase I don't particularly like, it's more polished. I just wish Tango Gameworks hadn't abandoned everything that was great about the first game, such as a developed world where nothing felt like it had been placed there at random. The problem with the first game's story was the way in which it was told, not the story itself. There was nothing wrong with Ruvik as a nemesis, so completely abandoning him for the sequel feels like a misstep. Early rumours are that this game isn't selling particularly well, which doesn't bode well for a third game or substantial DLC. I hope I'm wrong. If the third game takes the improved engine and gameplay from this one and combines it with the story and fleshed out world from the original, then we could be in for a classic. As it stands, The Evil Within 2 is just a really good game, not necessarily a particularly interesting one. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I don't think it's as interesting as my video on the first game, but hopefully you've got something out of it anyway. If you have, please consider hitting the like button and perhaps subscribing. If you want to be notified when I publish a new video, then hit the bell notification icon and hope that YouTube decides to do its job. You can also follow me on Twitter to stay up to date. Please let me know in the comments if you're able to fill in any of the gaps I couldn't resolve or have any ideas what that ending teaser means. I'm working on a lot of projects at the moment, so it's hard to say what's next. There's going to be a huge retrospective series on old school isometric CRPGs and how they've had a comeback in the last few years. The first video of this series will be on Fallout 1, and that's likely going to be my next video. I'm also going to start playing the Metro games, the Neo DLC, and will continue pushing through Persona 5, aka my Everest. I keep mentioning Persona 5 at the end of videos, so I should probably clarify what's happening with that one. I'm enjoying the game, but I'm finding it a bit of a slog. It's tough to get the enthusiasm to sit down and play it in big sessions when I know that even 8 hours with it isn't touching the sides. The biggest problem is that I only recently finished a lengthy playthrough of Persona 4. Persona 5 is obviously quite similar to 4, which is still fresh in my mind. Ideally, there would have been a bigger gap between me playing the two games. It's not a great idea to have my attention split between so many projects, however I'm trying to build up a lot of gameplay footage because I'll be in England for 3 weeks over Christmas. I won't have my PS4, but I should be able to write scripts and edit videos. I don't like the idea of going dark for such a long time, so I'm going to try and schedule a video to keep the content coming. Anyway, we've reached the end of the video at last. Thanks for watching. Cheers.